Hi, fourth graders. I'm reading today from The Borrowers, chapter 15. Hopefully you listened to chapter 14. I know I met with Maisie and Abby. We missed you, Riley, on Monday, and we didn't really talk about the book because I'm not sure. I don't think they had listened to it yet. So if we could just get on this habit of listening and being ready before we meet so we can talk about it. I figured this was a good idea so that we could save time. Instead of me having to first read aloud, we really leave no time for discussion. So if you can listen to the book before meeting with me, then we can actually talk just about the book the entire time. Okay, so we're coming down to the wire. I did read most of the book, or a little more than half the book with you in our sessions. But again, I'm going to be doing it this way for the rest of the book because I feel like I'd rather chat at this point since we're really deep into the story. So this is chapter 15. Get comfy and listen, please, in a nice quiet area. That night, while Arrietty lay straight and still under her cigar box ceiling, Homily and Pod talked for hours. They talked in the sitting room, they talked in the kitchen, and later, much later, she heard them talk in their bedroom. She heard drawers shutting and opening and doors creaking, boxes being pulled off from under beds. What are they doing? She wondered. What will happen next? Very still, she lay in her soft little bed with her familiar belongings around her. Her postage stamp view of Rio Harbor, her silver pig off a charm bracelet, her turquoise ring, which sometimes, for fun, she would wear as a crown, and dearest of all, her floating ladies with the golden trumpets, tooting above their peaceful town. She did not want to lose these, she realized suddenly, laying there straight and still in the bed. But to have all the other things as well, adventure and safety mixed, that's what she wanted, and that, the restless bangings and whisperings told her, is just what you couldn't do. As it happened, Humley was only fidgeting, opening drawers and shutting them, unable to be still, and she ended up with Pod, when Pod was already in bed, by deciding to curl her hair. Now, Homily, Pod protested wearily, lying there in his nightshirt. There's really no call for that. Who's going to see you? That's just it, exclaimed Homily, searching in a drawer for her curl rags. In times like this, we never know. I'm not going to be caught out, she said irritably, turning the drawer upside down and picking over the spilled contents with my hair like this. She came to bed at last, looking spiky, like a washed-out gollywog, and Pod, with a sigh, turned over at last and closed his eyes. Homily lay for a long time staring at the oil lamp. It was the silver cap of a perfume bottle with a tiny floating wick. She felt unwilling, for some reason, to blow it out. There were movements upstairs in the kitchen, and it was late for movements. The household should be asleep, and the lumpy curlers pressed uncomfortably around her neck. She gazed, just as Arrietty had done, about the familiar room. Too full, she realized, with little bags and boxes and makeshift cupboards, and thought, what now? Perhaps nothing will happen after all. Remember, she's pondering and thinking about how Pod and Arrietty were seen and thinking that they didn't, what was going to happen next. Were they going to have to leave or were they going to get told to leave? Would the boy tell on them? Would they, get caught? What would happen to their family? Perhaps nothing will happen after all. The child perhaps is right, and we are making a good deal of fuss about nothing. This boy, when all is said and done, is only a guest, perhaps, thought Homily. He'll go away again soon, and that, she told herself very drowsily, will be that. Later, she must have dozed off, because it seemed like she was crossing Parkin's Beck. It was night, and the wind was blowing, and the field seemed very steep. She was scrambling up along the ridge by the gas pipe, sliding and falling in wet grass. The trees, it seemed to Homily, were threshing and clashing, their branches waving and sawing against the sky. Then, as she told them many weeks later, there was a sound of splintering wood, and Homily woke up. She saw the room again and the oil lamp flickering, but something, she knew at once, was different. There was a strange drought, and her mouth felt dry and full of grit. Then she looked up at the ceiling. Pod, she shrieked. clutching her shoulder. Pod rolled over and sat up. They both stared at the ceiling. The whole surface was on a steep slant, and one side of it had come right away from the wall. This was what caused the draught, and down into the room, to within an inch of the foot of the bed, protruded a curious object. A huge bar of gray steel with a flattened, shiny edge. "It's a screwdriver," said Pod. They stared at it, fascinated, unable to move, and for a moment all was still. Then, slowly, the huge object swayed upward until the sharp edge lay against their ceiling, and Homily heard a scrape on the floor above and a sudden human gasp. "Oh, my knees," cried Homily. "Oh, my feeling," as with a splintering wet wrench, their whole roof flew off and fell down with a clatter somewhere out of sight. Homily screamed then, but this time it was a real scream, loud and shrill and hearty. She seemed almost to settle down in her scream while her eyes stared up, half interested into an empty lit space. There was another ceiling, she realized, up above them, away, higher, it seemed, than the sky. A ham hung from it, and 2 strings of onions. Arrietty appeared in the doorway, scared and trembling, clutching her nightgown. And Pod slapped Homily's back. "Be done," he said. "That is enough." And Homily suddenly was quiet. A great face appeared then between them and that distant height. It wavered above them, smiling and terrible. There was silence, and Homily sat bolt upright, her mouth open. "Is that your mother?" asked a surprised voice after a moment, and Arrietty from the doorway whispered, "Yes." It was the boy. Pod got out of bed and stood beside it, shivering in his nightshirt. "Come on," he said to Homily. "You can't stay here." But Homily could. She had her old nightdress on with the patch in the back, and nothing was going to move her. A slow anger was rising up in Homily. She had been caught in her hair curlers. Pod had raised his hand to her, and she remembered that. In the general upsetment, and for once in her life, she had left the supper washing up for morning. And there it would be on the kitchen table for all the world to see. Oh, here's a picture I'm going to try and show you. So, wait one sec. If you can look closely, there they are, right there. And there's the boy looking through the ceiling. I'm sorry, I was showing you the other direction, but this is actually how it looks. Imagine seeing that scary face. I mean, it's a little boy, but imagine to them how large and scary. Okay. I lost my place. Give me a sec. She glared at the boy. He was only a child after all. "Put it back," she said. "Put it back at once." Her eyes flashed and her curlers seemed to quiver. He knelt down then, but Homily didn't flinch. As the great face came slowly closer, she saw his underlip, pink and full like an enormous exaggeration of Arrietty's, and she saw it wobble slightly. "But I've got something for you," he said. Homily's expression did not change, and Arrietty called out from her place in the doorway, "What is it?" The boy reached behind him and very gingerly, careful to keep it upright, held up a wooden object above their heads. "It's this," he said, and very carefully, his tongue out of breath and breathing heavily, he lowered the object slowly into their hole. It was a doll's dresser, complete with plates. It had 2 drawers in it and a cupboard below. He adjusted its position at the foot of Homily's bed. Arrietty ran around to see better. "Oh," she cried ecstatically. "Mother, look!" Homily threw the dresser a glance. It was dark oak and the plates were hand-painted, and then she looked quickly away again. "Yes," she said coldly, "it is very nice." There was a short silence, which no one knew how to break. The cupboard really opens," said the boy at last, and the great hand came down amongst them, smelling of bath soap. Arrietty flattened against the wall, and Pod exclaimed, nervous, "Now then!" Yes, agreed Homily after a moment. I see it does. Pod drew a long breath, a sigh of relief as the hand went back. There, Homily, he said, you've always wanted something like that. Yes, said Homily. She sat upright, her hands clasped in her lap. Let me repeat that, sorry. Yes, said Homily. She still sat upright, her hands clasped in her lap. Thank you very much. And now, she went on coldly, will you please put back our roof? Wait a minute, pleaded the boy. Again, he reached behind him. Again, his hand came down, and there, beside the dresser, where there was barely any room for it, was a very small doll chair. It was very nice, a Victorian chair upholstered in red velvet. Oh, Arrietty said, and Pod said shyly, just about fit me, that would. Try it, begged the boy, and Pod threw him a nervous glance. Go on, said Arrietty, and Pod sat down in his nightshirt, his bare feet showing. That's nice, he said, after a moment. It would go by the fire in the sitting room, cried Arrietty. It would look lovely on red blotting paper. Let's try it, said the boy, and the hand came down again. Pod sprang up just in time to steady the dresser, and the red velvet chair was whisked away above his head and placed in the next room. Arrietty ran out the door and along the passage to see. Oh, she called out to her parents, come and see. It is lovely. But Pod and Homily did not move. The boy was leaning over them, breathing hard, and they could see the middle buttons of his nightshirt. He seemed to be examining the whole room a little further. What do you keep in that mustard pot? He asked. Coal, said Arrietty's voice, and I helped to borrow the new carpet. Here's the watch I told you about and the pictures. If I could get you some better stamps than those, the boy said. I've got some Jubilee ones. They have the Taj Mahal on it. Look, cried Arrietty's voice again, and Pod took Homily's hand. These are my books. Homily clutched Pod as the great hand came down once more in the direction of Arrietty. Quiet, he whispered. Sit still. The boy, it seemed, was touching the books. What are they called? He asked, and Arrietty reeled off the names. Pod, whispered a Homily, I'm going to scream. No, whispered Pod, you mustn't, not again. I feel it coming. No, hold your breath, he said, and count to 10. The boy was saying to Arrietty, why couldn't you read me these? Well, I could, said Arrietty, but I'd rather read something new. But you never come, complained the boy. I know, said Arrietty, but I will. Pod, whispered Homily, did you hear that? Did you hear what she said? Yes, yes, Pod whispered. Keep quiet. Do you want to see the storerooms? Arrietty suggested. Meet next, and Homily clapped a hand to her mouth as though she was going to hold back a cry. Pod looked up at the boy. Hey, he called, trying to attract his attention. The boy looked down. Put the roof back now. Pod begged him, trying to sound matter-of-fact and reasonable. We're getting cold. All right, agreed the boy, but he seemed to hesitate. He reached across them for a piece of board which formed their roof. Shall I nail you down? He asked, and then they saw him pick up a hammer. It swayed above them, very dangerous looking. Of course, nail us down, said Pod, irritably. I mean, said the boy, I've got some more things upstairs. Pod looked uncertain, and Homily nudged at him. Ask him, she whispered. What kind of things? Things from an old dollhouse there is on top of the shelf of the cupboard by the fireplace in the schoolroom. I've never seen no doll's house, said Pod. Well, it's in the cupboard, said the boy, right up by the ceiling. You can't see it. You've got to climb on the lower shelves to get to it. What sort of things are in that doll's house? Asked Arrietty from the sitting room. Oh, everything, the boy told her. Carpets and rugs and beds with mattresses, and there's a bird cage, not a real one, of course, and cooking pans and tables and five chairs and a pot and dish of plaster tarts and an imitation leg of mutton. Homily leaned across to Pod. Tell him to nail us down lightly, she whispered. Well, let me repeat that, whispering it. Tell him to nail us down lightly, she whispered. Pod stared at her. She nodded, clasping her hands. Pod turned to the boy. All right, he said. You nail us down, but lightly, if you see what I mean. Just a tap or two, here and there. So that is the end of chapter 15. And I'm going to want to talk about what he meant by telling him by homily telling Pod to tell the boy just to nail it down lightly. So hopefully you'll be ready when we meet today. All right. I hope you enjoyed it. It's getting really good. We'll talk later.